And the Environmental Justice Act was about defending our communities. Years ago, we marched all across the state of Colorado, worked collaboratively with state legislators to pass the Environmental Justice Act, despite a veto threat from Governor Polis. For me, I grew up in a former Superfund site where from my front yard, I can see a smokestack. And what I've learned since then is more than 189 businesses are violating federal law in 4 square miles. Asleep at the wheel for enforcement doesn't even begin to say the injustices that happen to our community and why we collectively came together across the state to pass 1339, which said not only must we take climate action, that we also must work collaboratively to address environmental justice. I'm lucky to have been appointed to the state's Environmental Justice Action Task Force aside Councilwoman Renee Chacon. And in that effort, we've worked diligently with the state of Colorado to try to set up rules and regulations that protect our communities. What's really unfortunate, though, is that we have consistently seen good legislation go to the Air Quality Control Commission to be gutted, to be rolled back, to do more harm in our communities. And we are grateful for Representatives Routenell and Weissman who have brought forward this legislation with 1339 to undo the harm by not following what the Environmental Justice Act was meant to do. I want to be clear, we participated in the disproportionately impacted community rulemaking at the Air Quality Control Commission. We turned out community member after community member and participated throughout the whole process, only to have it not turn out the way that would actually be in the intent of the Environmental Justice Act. We also participated in the GEM 2, known as the industrial portion of the rulemaking for the Air Quality Control Commission, only to find out that we would end up with a rule that would allow polluters to pay into a fund instead of reducing emissions in our communities. We were empowered by the righteous civil rights movement that took place through the George Floyd protests. We can't breathe the air means double for communities, Black and brown communities that are both oppressed by the police and oppressed by pollution. We have the research like the Pandemic of Pollution, which was released by the US Congress during the early months of COVID, making the direct connection between these tiny toxic particles that terrorize the lungs of our children and our elders in our communities. And it's why we work diligently to rein in the pollution from these 18 worst facilities. What I can tell you is that some of the worst actors like Coors and Suncor have had thousands of violations over the years, and they continue to pay to play. We cannot allow that, and we cannot allow Governor Polis's administration to roll back the Environmental Justice Act as we've continued to work so hard. Green Latinos is lucky to have members all across the state and to have partnerships with local governments. And so today you are going to hear from leaders from the Commerce City and from the city and county of Denver about why they are too standing up with yes on 1339. And we encourage everyone to show up tomorrow, to testify, to continue to write your legislators. And I'm happy now to pass it off to my friend, at-large City Councilwoman Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez, who has worked diligently alongside Green Latinos and other members to improve our air quality in the metro area.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ian. And it's great to see folks on this call today. My name is Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez, and I am one of your Denver City Council members at large, representing the whole city of Denver. I am not only an elected official, but my family has been here in Denver for generations. I'm also a mom of 3 children, and that is why I am here today in support of House Bill 1339, because it's past time to act, and our communities, they deserve better. And so I definitely appreciate the people that are here and have been fighting these fights for a long time. Colorado must move forward and answer the needs of our most vulnerable and most impacted communities who are bearing the brunt of life-changing pollution. We have known for a long time that industrial pollution is causing significant health issues for Coloradans. And by failing to close loopholes that let polluters pay to comply, instead of actually reducing emissions, we will fail yet another generation of people that I represent, including my own children and potentially their children. There is no excuse for that. Now, state air regulators are considering giving polluters an option to pay a fee instead of meeting the Environmental Justice Act targets. This cannot happen. I was honored enough to be in the state legislature in 2021 when we passed the Environmental Justice Act that was brought forth, I believe, by then Representative Dominique Jackson and Representative Mike Weissman. I was honored to sign on as a co-sponsor of this legislation to ensure that those who are disproportionately impacted would be protected. And we have yet to make good on those efforts. Industrial pollution is actually on track to increase instead of reducing in the near term because the state has ignored the call for rapid near-term emission reductions. House Bill 1339 will ensure that the state is actually compliant with its own laws that we passed over 3 years ago. This bill is not only important for my constituents, for my loved ones, for my family here in Denver, but there are no boundaries when it comes to air pollution. Let's be real about that, right? It's not like, oh, you're in Commerce City, you're in Denver, and oh, there's like a magic wall there. So I'm urging our state lawmakers and our governor to act before another generation suffers the irreversible health impacts that can be prevented by passing House Bill 1339. I thank you all again for having me join you all today. It's so great to see the folks here. And I'm so sorry, but I'm not sure who I pass it off to. And so I'm going to go back to Ian to maybe help me do that.
Next is you, Councilwoman Renee Chacon.
Claso kamati umeto, claso kamati atatonati, claso kamati tonantinkleli, claso kamati abuelitos y abuelitas, and all the ones that came before. We live in the land of the Ute, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Shoshone, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Lakota, the Dene, the Inde, the Chicano, and 48 tribes that still live and travel through this space. I remind you of that because we are still here. And I see the word equity constantly thrown around in a way that does not actually look at our cumulative impacts. And environmental justice has honestly been performative in this state that invalidates the EJ Act and the EJ Action Task Force that I did not take lightly. Honestly, I am honored to work in spaces with Ian Tafoya and so many others, especially Councilwoman Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez, to be able to bring finally recognition that no, it's not okay to pay to pollute or pay to sacrifice my community in Commerce City. Commerce City has people here living. We're becoming a bedroom community. It is not just a tale of two cities where it's the core city of an industrial space, but is also a space where we're trying to finally recognize that we need not just environmental justice, but restorative justice. We are never going to be on a path of a just transition if we're not able to take real accountability that industry still right now can legally be a precedent to set dangerous levels of emissions that kill my community with cumulative impacts of benzene, hydrogen cyanide, hydrogen sulfide. We're not just against Suncor, we're against bad emitters that are killing our children and making them have to miss school with constant asthma attacks, eczema, and so many other forms of diseases and cancers nobody's children deserve. When I talk about our future generations, that means it's literally lying within us now. So when we're asking you to act, we're no longer asking. When we initially rolled out so many of this legislation and this bills, I asked at that press conference, if you're not ready to step up, please move out of the way. It's no longer please. It's honestly getting to the point that as a mother, we are concerned about how our water, how our air, how our land, and our quality of life you cannot profit off of is honestly going to work for the rest of our generations. I am here to be able to ask our administration, our state, and our current legislators to be able to pass finally a recognition of true equity. Equity is being able to bring community into these spaces. This is just the initial seeding to recognize that community outreach and oversight is a recognition not just on a local level in Commerce City or in local municipalities where the rubber hits the road, as I always hear, but it is also on a state level where the state has to make accountability that industry should not influence where you have profits over people. I'm tired of working at it every day at land use, and this was finally our recognition. So agencies that work in permitting that I can't influence with any way of power, that you can actually finally close loopholes, not live in silos, and recognize that my community deserves the human right to live with a quality of life, again, you cannot profit off of. So as people over polluters, not only should we pass legislation like this to finally develop a just transition, but we should finally recognize that in our workforce, in our labor unions, and in our communities, we are all connected. We are connected in our biosphere. We're connected across municipalities. We're connected across agencies. And if you are actually a human being within your organization or your agency, you will understand that it's not only recognizing human life deserves a reality and a right to live and thrive, but so does our rights of nature and biosphere. So I thank you for the ability to be in this space. As you can tell, I'm very passionate because I love my community and I fiercely love my community. So klaso kamati ometo.
Thank you, Renee. Now we're going to pivot to a couple of our experts on the issues here. So Rebecca Curry with Earth Justice is going to just dive into a little bit of the components about the actual legislation itself, 1339, which will have amendments for a strike below tomorrow, and we will provide the details related to that strike below.
Hi, everyone. My name is Becca Curry. I'm an attorney and policy counsel with Earth Justice in the Rocky Mountain office. You know, this bill, House Bill 1339, really seeks to hold the state accountable for several protections promised in the Environmental Justice Act, as Ian and Renee and Serena shared. There were two rulemakings required by the Environmental Justice Act that particularly impacted communities that this bill sort of aims to ensure that they are as strong as anticipated with the passage of the EJ Act. The first rulemaking was is sort of commonly known as the GEM rulemaking, the Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Energy Management for Manufacturers, very long name, so called the GEM rulemaking, was required by the Environmental Justice Act to sort of implement a clear target, mandating reductions of greenhouse gas emissions from the industrial sector. But the rules ultimately adopted by the Air Quality Control Commission fell short in several key ways. For example, the rules, don't guarantee the level of emissions reduction sort of required of the industrial sector from the Environmental Justice Act. The rules also allow sources to trade and purchase emissions reductions credits towards their compliance, and the rules allow sources to pay into a pay-to-pollute mitigation fund instead of achieving on-site reductions. Many groups really showed up in the GEM rule, and ultimately it was disappointing to see the rules ultimately adopted contained several loopholes that really sort of gutted the protections anticipated in the rule. The second rulemaking that was required by the Environmental Justice Act with particular impacts to communities was called the DIC permitting rulemaking. This was one where, the Environmental Justice Act required a rulemaking to provide for enhanced modeling and monitoring requirements for new and modified sources of affected pollutants in disproportionately impacted communities. So it looked to sort of increase review of pollution specifically in disproportionately impacted communities. And similar to the GEM rule, the DIC permitting rule also fell short. The rules ultimately adopted allow most polluters to avoid monitoring their emissions at the source and instead pay into a vague community monitoring fee. The rules also failed to monitor harmful toxic air pollutions, limited the most stringent requirements to only a handful of sources, and then most critically, improperly divided disproportionately impacted communities, which is a state-defined term, into essentially two subclasses, with one class receiving less protection than the other. The rules ultimately adopted effectively cut out about half of all disproportionately impacted communities from the protections contemplated by the rules. So that's just a bit of a high-level overview about the background behind two rulemakings that were required by the Environmental Justice Act and how they ultimately fell short. And House Bill 1339, intends to respond to these deficiencies and hold the state accountable to the protections promised in the Environmental Justice Act to ensure we're better protecting communities.
Thank you, Becca. And I will just add that we Green Latinos, represented by Earth Justice, are also in active litigation because we do believe that the disproportionately impacted rulemaking violates the law of the Environmental Justice Act. And so this is also another avenue that we are pursuing to reverse creating two classes of the people who need protection the most. As I laid out to you, we saw so clearly from COVID what the impacts were to our communities across Greeley, across North Denver. We deserve better. We're asking for people to stand with us. We have been in deep conversations with labor, trying to explain to them that yes, on-site reductions protect your community the most. We know that they were appalled when they heard that Molson Coors and Suncor have had violations every single quarter of the last 3 years, where Suncors were considered high priority violations. Outside of air, Molson Coors, sterile ethanol, JBS Swift Meat Plant, and Cargill Meat have been violators every single quarter for the last 3 years for their water permits. This is unacceptable for the protections of the workers. This is unacceptable for the community surrounding them. This is unacceptable for the lack of enforcement from CDPHE and the Environmental Protection Agency. We will not allow the Colorado Energy Office nor the governor to take us backwards on protecting disproportionately impacted communities. We are asking everyone to join the dozens of community groups who have signed on to 1339, to the city and county of Denver and Commerce City, both mayors whom have provided statements who are speaking out, and tomorrow will also be testifying representatives from the city about this critical legislation. You can join us at Energy and Environment at 1:30 p.m. tomorrow. We do know that the meeting has been moved inside to the Capitol, and we're happy to take questions from the press now.
We'll now open the floor for any questions.
I do have a question. Do you hear me?
Yes.
I should maybe even open my video. Okay, thank you so much for having me. I am Rosana Longobetter, and I am the bilingual newsletter editor of La Ciudad. And I have a question for you. How do you intend to ensure community voices are heard and acknowledged? And my second question is, how do you plan to balance the economic arguments with the community needs? Thank you.
Renee, looks like you want to join in there.
Honestly, this starts adapting requirements for community monitoring to where we can develop community modeling on our own. There is no community modeling, and it's getting to the point that even if you reach out to agencies, you can't put a complaint system at the ECMC and other spaces, including the CDPHE. It's incredibly hard to reach out to these organizations and be able to even have the community involved. That's against the EJ Act. We have best practices outreach that these agencies should be able to follow, and this is a recommendation finally pushed into legislation. So this is one way to address the community outreach aspect, but this is only just the beginning. We legitimately need community oversight boards, in my opinions, in many spaces, because we have a lot of developers and industry able to influence state rulemakings and state regulations, but we're not able to actually have community have any way in until the end, as we all know. So I would like to see more of the EJ Act in that passed more adaptively, but also community involved in boards and commissions pushed broadly, especially community members that are in disproportionately impacted communities be able to be in these regulatory spaces and decision-making spaces. So that's the first part of your question. I often already have to battle a lot of the economic gains. I've legitimately been told from rail yard systems that it's for the economy that we're able to hold down your community between 112th and 104th for 4 hours during some of the worst traffic density and population density times. No, it's not. It's at the sacrifice of my community through those emissions, through the redlining, through all of the population and traffic density that they have to endure in all of Commerce City. Commerce City is still seen as a transportation space, not a place that people live. This finally develops the disproportionately impacted communities are there. We live here and we have to breathe here. And a lot of your workforce has to also work here. So this develops a level of understanding that disproportionately impacted communities should not only have to weigh in, but that we live and breathe here, and we should be able to at least be involved in the decision-making spaces and have a quality of life, again, that has an equitable protection that you cannot profit off of. And when we're looking at local municipalities are not corporations. They're organizations that should be able to represent community equity from this perspective of environmental justice, especially spaces like Commerce City with such large proportions and large populations of DIC, so disproportionately impacted communities. I hope that answers some of your questions.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to jump in here a little bit too and say this idea that a just transition doesn't include thinking about the impacts to workers Investing in new control technology is jobs. It requires people to install the technology, to monitor the technology, to be trained to use the technology. It protects the workers. There's also costs and impacts to communities whom for in all reality, Medicaid costs are the things that are passed on to the counties. That is the externality that is passed on from these corporate polluters that are harming communities. It is passed on to the water utilities whom have to pull out all of these toxics out of the water that go from the air to the water or directly into the water because they are allowed to pollute. So those prices are already being exacted into these local communities, but there's opportunity. When you allow trading of emissions credits, that means it doesn't actually have to take place in your community. That's not good for the local workers. That's not good for the unions. And we want to be clear. We want to say realized installation of appropriate technology to both solve the climate crisis and tackle what we call co-pollution that is most directly harming our communities with toxics now.
Just to
Yeah,
follow what you just said, Ian, I want to ask you, how do you ensure that those jobs go to the communities that are the most affected, to the young people that are affected and that would like to have a job?
Well, workforce development is certainly an incredibly important part to the just transition and something that we talk about with local communities, with local unions, with elected leaders, among everybody else. Ultimately, I'm unable to guarantee as the director of Green Latinos that these jobs will go into our communities. What I can tell you is that I spend countless hours working in the schools and educating communities at rec centers about opportunity, and the youth are excited about the opportunity to not only save the planet, as a young person might describe it, but also build a career for their communities. And I do see that there's also a question in here from 9 News as well. Rosanna, do you have any other questions or related to what I just said?
I'm really good. Thank you so much.
Perhaps, Alex, this might be a good question for you to answer from 9 News. And you can introduce yourself, Alex. That'd be great.
Thanks, Ian. Alex DeGolia, Director, State Climate Policy at the Environmental Defense Fund. And yes, so, I mean, Ian, you can speak to this as well, but Mallory, to your good question, the short answer is yes, it would still allow compliance via greenhouse gas credit trading programs. I think that this is an area where there's probably some disagreement among some of our groups. EDF's worked on compliance trading extensively for years. Other folks here, I know Ian and I have had spirited debate about this, and he disagrees with our position on this. But the short answer for why that might be the case is that, well, a couple of things. First, if you're participating in a robust greenhouse gas credit trading program, that reduction is real and verifiable and happened at a facility that's participating in that program. Whereas the prohibition on making a payment, the way that that's structured right now, or is expected to be structured coming out of the GEM 2 rule, is you're paying into a state managed fund with no certainty whatsoever that it would lead to verifiable and additional greenhouse gas emission reductions. The other thing that I would add is that in the bill, there is a separate provision that requires the Air Commission to adopt facility-specific limits on pollution for any facility found to adversely affect a disproportionately impacted community, and that those reductions must occur on site. So we see that at EDF as a means of ensuring that even if there is participation in a greenhouse gas credit trading program, you're not just essentially hotspotting by allowing facilities located in the most vulnerable communities in Colorado to purchase credits in lieu of reducing emissions on site. And those things really sort of need to go together in order to ensure that that those communities, like the council members' communities, are being are are being protected by requiring emissions to occur on site. And if there are other opportunities for reductions at facilities, that sort of represent those real and additional reductions outside of those communities, then there would be an opportunity for compliance via that kind of program. That said, that's EDF's perspective. Ian might say, yes, we think of that as a concern, and I guess I raise that only because this has brought together diverse groups focused on these really legitimate concerns about implementing the EJ Act in ways that really that address the sort of dual obligations of the state under the EJ Act to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with what is necessary for a safe climate future, and protect Colorado's most vulnerable communities through reductions of dangerous co-pollutants. So I'll stop there, Ian.
I think you hit it spot on, Alex. I think that there is disagreement amongst people on our side of the work. Why? Because much like people are talking about new emerging technology, we see that our community and our leaders, and when I say our leaders, I mean our regulators, can't even take care of the toys they have now. And so when we think about creating systems that might allow people to trade and create hotspots in communities where we don't know if they'll be verifiable and real reductions, we prefer everybody to reduce and protect the communities that are near them. In the future, couldn't that change? Perhaps. But at this moment, I'm not in a position to support a system that we already believe is failing us by giving it new opportunities to fail us. That's not acceptable and not what our communities ask for, and not why we marched for the Environmental Justice Act.
All right, we're about 30 minutes now. If there's any more questions, I'll give you about 1 minute to respond, and then we'll end the call. And thank you all for your participation.
Yes, Ian, I have a question for you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Knowing that the neighborhoods there, Glowville, Swansea, all been under this tremendous cloud from Commerce City with Suncor and other refineries that were meatpacking companies and so forth for decades. When they establish their facilities, are any of them protected by any type of grandfather clauses that prevents them from moving to these, as you call it, emerging technologies?
The time from the time some of these original facilities began operating, right? We know the refinery being in existence under different names for many decades. As we've advanced both the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and other environmental laws, they are able to apply for permits to pollute. And it is those permits to pollute that they are continuing to violate and pay to play. We know recently, for example, there was a lauding by the state government that this was the largest fine in state history. They could have charged them like $34 million. We got them for 2 that comes back to the community, and 8 that they can invest back into their facility and probably take on their taxes in the end. Historical for the state, lackadaisical for the community. Will they be able to apply new emerging technologies? It is very possible that they may be able to apply for some of these new technologies. That will require a permitting process. And groups like Gray and Latinos have been working diligently to educate our communities. Our most recent town hall around carbon capture and sequestration was both hybrid. We had about 50 community members who joined on. We're going to be in Glenwood Springs for a meeting here on tomorrow, actually. We were in Pueblo a week ago. We're trying to get our communities up to speed. What I'll say is these things, these new technologies, mining in general, are inherently speculative. And it is through that speculation that they have left a legacy of pollution in our communities that is documentable, empty and abandoned flow lines, harm into the rivers, abandoned mines. And so, again, back to the same comment that I made before, we're not inclined to say you deserve something shiny and new if you're not even compliant with what you're doing now.
One other question, when I-70 started their expansion, and I believe it was Kiewit that was one of the major contractors, there was an issue with the pollution going on at that time. Was Green Latinos involved in trying to deal with the amount of pollution that was going to take place through that whole corridor?
Yes, I at that time became a Green Latinos member. I've only been working for Green Latinos, and Green Latinos Colorado's only been existing for 5 years. So in the sense that yes, I and many other Latino leaders like Candice Baca and Debbie Ortega were involved in trying to tackle the pollution through that corridor, both from air, water, and soil, with representation first by the Sierra Club lawyers and then by Earth Justice. So yes, Latino leaders from the beginning, in my mind, whether that's Lorraine Granado to now, have been fighting back to try to protect the communities in these neighborhoods.
Now, I know we're almost out of time, but you mentioned some about new opportunities and about the technology. We're talking about the air, and being Colorado as high up as we are. Is there, maybe not in this conversation, but through email, can you share some of those? What is the technology, new opportunities that can be presented to these, like Suncor and the others out there, that the technology is available, follow it, or by all means, stop the amount of pollutants in the air?
We're happy to share that with you, and I might consult with some of my partners here. One thing is very clear to me. We must begin to stop the flares. There is no reason why we continue to have open burning flares 24 hours a day in North Denver from Suncor. We can close those. That's a great first step.
I agree. Okay, thank you.
I do have one last question, if that's okay. There's a big effort right now of moving forward and planting trees and offering trees. Right now, for example, now that Earth Day is coming, there's a lot of giveaways of trees to be planted. How effective are trees against such polluter as Suncor and the other ones in the area? And how many trees do we need to plant?
Trees are good for communities, for stormwater, for heat management, for mental health, for cleaning the air. In particular, we won some in the I-70 settlement. Evergreen trees that are densely planted together near pollution sources can effectively help clean the air year round and also push emissions further into the atmosphere to be dispersed. A calculation on how many trees could balance out the harm of and legacy of all these polluters I don't have for you, Rosanna. But at the end of the day, we need to plant trees and tell the polluters to reduce. It is only through that kind of combination that we're actually going to be successful. We can't just greenwash and say plant trees. And trees also require to be cared for like a living being for many, many years. There are certain communities in Denver who have parkways that are watered by the city. And when we plant trees in GES, we make it the responsibility of the homeowners. That still hasn't been figured out yet in my mind either.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me. My information I'll put in the chat. And for all our speakers, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it, and we will keep you posted on the bill progress tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.
Did it.